تبسم وخل الهموم وخل الغموم وخل الضجر ولا تبتئس من صروف الزمان ولا تشتكي من طعون البشر.
We are fortunate in that we today have as a guest speaker a renowned Muslim lawyer as well as a photojournalist. Brother Thomas Dallal is a Muslim lawyer and an award-winning photojournalist, and this was sent to me as the biography. So from what I had researched was a bit dangerous, because I placed him at a ripe 24 years of age, when in actual fact he's somewhat a bit different from 24, he's almost double that. Thomas Dallal is a Muslim lawyer and an award-winning photojournalist who has worked in the Middle East since the 1990s. He worked internationally for 15 years as a photojournalist for leading international publications and as a commercial photographer in, amongst other lands, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Bangladesh, Indonesia and North America. He later studied law and worked for the appeals judge president at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague in 2008. In 2009, Tom became a legal advisor for the Palestinian Liberal Organization's Negotiation Support Unit in Ramallah. He later worked for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees and the UN Office for the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs in Jerusalem. During the Arab Spring, Tom worked as team leader in Libya for the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue based in Tripoli. Tom currently works as a photographer and a lawyer based in Palestine. And based on the history, obviously, he's going to give us, inshallah, some of his travel experiences in addition to, more importantly, focus on the lands of Palestine. Without further ado, it gives us great pleasure to call upon Brother Thomas Dallal.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Can everyone hear me? I'm a little taller than you are, so I'll raise the mic. Thank you. It's a special pleasure to come to South Africa and to be here with you in your mosque. I had the pleasure of coming here shortly before apartheid ended, and also again shortly after apartheid was gone. It's been about 20 years, in other words. But my wife and I have been very warmly received, and that's something we're very, very grateful for. South Africa, for Palestinians, holds a special place because it overcame, if not entirely, it overcame great injustices that are in some ways parallel to the injustices that we face in Palestine. So we're grateful for the support that has come from South Africa, and I wanted to open with that because it's heartfelt and something very profound to us in a world that has sometimes been less than friendly. My father was born in Jerusalem. He was raised in the West Bank and left in 1949 to study. He went to the United States to study. Consequently, I was born in the United States and was raised between the United States and Kuwait. I lived in Kuwait in the 70s growing up. So I got to know my Palestinian family and my roots from a very young age, despite being an American-born American citizen. That motivated me to return to the Middle East. And 25 years ago, after studying myself in the United States, I traveled back to my father's native land as a photojournalist to cover parts of the First Intifada. It was 1989, 1990. And then I went back many times through the 90s to cover the fitful first years of the so-called Oslo peace process. I was then absent for a long time, and I became a lawyer in the interim. 5 years ago, after becoming a lawyer, I returned again to Palestine, and I want to share with you some of my experiences, some of my observations, and a little bit of perspective looking back over the course of a 25-year period, because much has stayed the same, but really a lot has changed, and there's a lot that goes on there, and there's a lot of nuance and small things in the daily life of people that doesn't make the news, that you won't necessarily know about, and that doesn't, I should say really, it doesn't make the news, it's not deemed newsworthy, but the big story, to my mind, in Palestine is beyond the assaults on Gaza. It's beyond the news hit that happens for a week. It's the ongoing story of what the Israelis are doing to our land. So I guess I should say that as a photojournalist in the 90s, I certainly witnessed violence perpetrated by Israel's military and some of their settlers against my people. But it didn't really prepare me for what I found when I returned in 2009. And it was something of a shock. I should say, actually, it was a big shock. There's a very heavy feeling in the air, as if a control system has taken a lot more active role in the lives of average people. So, obviously the wall that Israel constructed, 600 plus kilometers of 5-foot-high concrete, is and of course it's been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice in 2004. It's the most conspicuous symbol of the direction that things have gone since I returned to Palestine first in the late 80s. But it may be the most conspicuous symbol, but it's really just one part of what I call and consider a total control and domination system. And that's a system that doesn't just affect Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It's really a system that in its various permutations affects Palestinians throughout historic Palestine, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in Jerusalem, and in the areas that were occupied in 1948. I want to try and illustrate with a couple of examples some of how this system works. And so I'm trying to go a little bit beyond the news feed that you get, and I'm sure that as Muslims you've paid close attention to what's going on, particularly over the summer, the terrible events in Gaza over the summer. So the first thing I'd like to touch, in 1990, when I wanted to travel from Ramallah to Jerusalem, the long 15-kilometer trip, took me about 10 minutes on a bad day, and I didn't have to think about it. Today, to make that trip, it takes about, if I'm lucky, I might be able to do it in an hour, unusual. More likely, I will budget an hour and a half to make that trip. Now, why is that? That's because Israel has constructed the wall surrounding Jerusalem, and I have to pass through a checkpoint in order to get through there. A checkpoint, sometimes two checkpoints. Now, I should put a little footnote here and explain something. Because I was born in the United States, and because my father was not present in Palestine in 1967, he never obtained the right to live in his place of origin. The Israelis conducted a census in 1967. If you weren't there on the ground, you lost your right to live in the place of your birth. That means he never had that right after 67, and he was never able to pass that right to me. Now, that's a grave injustice, but in the current system, and it's quite perverse, in the current system, because I never had the right of residency, the Israelis look at me as American-born, American citizen, and I'm able to travel much more freely than my Palestinian brothers and sisters. So I can travel freely from the West Bank into Jerusalem without a permit. I have to pass through the checkpoints. I have to deal with the army. I have to deal with all the delays and all the randomness and the violence. But I'm not forced to go to the Israeli military authorities and subject myself to their scrutiny, the scrutiny of their intelligence services, in order to obtain a permit to enter the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem for Palestinians is obviously a center for religion. It's our social center. It's our economic center. And it's very much a cultural center for us. So the denial of access to Jerusalem for literally millions of West Bank and Gaza Strip Palestinians, not to mention all of the refugees and others who've been cast out of their country, is really a very dramatic downward trend from when I first started going to Palestine in 1990. I'll give you an example of a recent experience that I had. Before coming here, I decided that I wanted to visit Al-Aqsa and the Haram al-Sharif to photograph them so that I could bring some photographs here to show people here. So, knowing a little bit of experience in what I was going to be up against, I decided that I was going to go into Jerusalem on Thursday and scout and figure out whether I could actually do what I intended to do. When I got there on Thursday morning, turns out that the Israelis had completely shut the compound down, and there was no way for me to enter. Then, arbitrarily, at about 1 o'clock, they opened the Haram al-Sharif back up in the Aqsa. So I went in, and I walked around and looked around, and there was full access, but I learned that very morning, the Israelis had shut the compound down in order to allow a group of religious Israeli Jews to enter the compound. So they excluded Muslims and allowed these people whose ideology, by the way, calls for the very destruction of our presence and our holy sites, including the Al-Aqsa. So this to me is, how should I say, it's a very alarming development because it represents something that I saw in the 90s with the Haram Ibrahimi in Hebron, which is basically that the Israelis gradually assume greater and greater control over our religious sites, gradually exclude us at the times of their choosing, and do so under a security pretext, and then it morphs into a pretext that they have an equal religious claim. And the impact is rather harsh. Some of you have probably visited Jerusalem, but the whole Haram al-Sharif Aqsa compound and area is a very central thing for the community in the old city. Children grow up playing there. They grow up doing their homework there. And the tenuous hold that we are somehow maintaining over it is really, we feel that we're very much under pressure, at great risk. And that this is something that people around the world should be aware of, and that Muslims in particular should be aware of, because it's part of our heritage and legacy. So that was Thursday. Friday morning, I get up before Fajr in Ramallah. I drive, it takes me about an hour and a half to get in. I get to the old city, wanting to go to the Haram Sharif, and lo and behold, the old city has been completely surrounded by the army. They're not letting anyone under the age of 50 even enter the old city who doesn't have an ID that shows that they're a resident in the old city. A major military operation. So I ended up photographing mostly young men, but also some older people, praying in a parking lot outside the old city walls, unable to enter the Haram al-Sharif. I discussed this with many of them, and they'd come from all over the country. Some of them had come from far north near the Lebanese border in the Galilee, from Nazareth. Many had obtained permits to come in and pray from the West Bank. That's not an easy process. To get a permit to come into Jerusalem, if you're living in the West Bank, subjects you to huge scrutiny. They look to see, what is your family? Who are your relatives? Have they been in jail? Are they politically active? You are really at the mercy of a regime that doesn't really want you there. I then went up and photographed the scene from the Mount of Olives. I know the city well enough to know that somewhere I could go and photograph the dawn light, and the compound was empty. There was no one in there. But I persisted. I stuck around, and I managed to get into the old city and learned that the midday prayers would be taking place, and they would open the compound, and they did. And I'm very fortunate that I'm 50 years old plus 6 months, which means that I fit. I was part of the category of men over the age of 50 who would be allowed to enter and pray, and the category of women over the age of 45 who would be allowed to enter and pray. This, as a small anecdote of life for us, I hope gives you something of an idea of what's not in the news and what's a little bit off the hard news and violence. The violence that we are enduring it's somehow maybe more subtle than someone committing a violent act against you, but you're being controlled and kept into very narrow bounds. And I can imagine that, especially the older among you, is this something you can relate to and recall from your experience here in South Africa. I'm going to segue to another anecdote. I think that the point with this small story that I've just told you, it's symbolic of a denial of our freedom and rights as the people who come from this place. We're enduring a great deal of injustice, but it's an old history. It's an old history which we're only seeing in that example today a continuation of a pattern that started in the 40s, in the late 40s, when Israel was established. So I want to tell you the story of my father-in-law. My father-in-law was born in a small village just outside of Nazareth called Mjedel. During the 48 war, his father was arrested randomly. He was a construction worker, wrong place, wrong time, picked up by a force of armed Jewish Israeli, at that point they were a Jewish armed group, arrested him, held him incommunicado for a month, threatened him, terrified him. He and the rest of the village left the village because they were threatened. After he was released, sort of suddenly, he went back to the village was evacuated. Everybody left. The Mukhtar told everyone to leave because they'd been threatened. They went to Nazareth, which is all of about 5 kilometers away. And the village was razed to the ground subsequently. My father-in-law's father decided that their safety as a family was in question. And he was fearful for his own life and for his family, so they decided that they were going to leave. They walked, my father-in-law and his father walked all the way to Lebanon, a hike that I did 10 days ago to understand what he'd done as a 10-year-old boy. They went to Lebanon, felt unwelcome there as refugees. They went to Syria. They were joined by his wife, my father-in-law's mother and sisters. The entire family went through a circuitous route from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan. By 1950, they decided that they were going to return, no matter what. And they, quite literally, my father-in-law's mother was a young woman with, I think at that point, 7 children. They literally infiltrated back across the border and returned to Nazareth. Mjedel, where they were from, had been razed to the ground, as I think I mentioned. Not only razed to the ground, but they were forbidden from even returning there. They lived as fugitives in their own state, without any ID, trying to steer clear of being detected by the authorities in the new Jewish state. And eventually, several years later, after they were apprehended, there was enormous political pressure put on the government of Israel to recognize and provide Israeli citizenship to 10 or 20,000 other similarly situated people. Now, I want to tell you, fast forward, what does it look like today where my father-in-law was from? In Jadal, their olive trees are now part of a park. It's an Israeli Jewish town. There's almost no evidence of the former community of Jadal. The land, my father-in-law's family's land, is now a L'Oreal factory. And as I said, some of the olive groves are part of a public park. They have a sign proudly proclaiming that they were the first settlers in the town who established the park. Now, I want to mention this story not because the story in of itself is particularly unusual, but because it's a pattern, it's a history that's repeating itself in a slight variation in Israel's settlement, which is a euphemism, in its colonial enterprise to settle the West Bank. The confiscation of my father-in-law's family's property, the fact that he was never compensated, that none of them have ever been compensated for any of their property losses, and the fact that communities have been established there as if these people never existed, this is very similar to the pattern that's taking place in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So, when you hear about settlers, it doesn't really sound so terrible. When you think of the American West, people who settled the American West, that's, as an American-born boy, that's what I think of. But in fact, these people are colonists. They're coming to our country. They're setting up houses, getting the government to support them, getting connected to electricity and water and all services, building roads. There are now 600,000 people living in the West Bank who have no claim to the place beyond establishing facts on the ground through force. I want to also go back to the story of Nazareth. Nazareth and the areas within Israel, 48 Israel, what the Israelis did, after they took all the people's land and pushed all the people into the population centers, they've allowed them to stay in places like Nazareth. Nazareth is incredibly densely populated. They don't have any room to grow. The lands belonging to people like my father-in-law are where they're building their communities. Communities with parks and wide open areas, exclusively for the benefit of the Jewish people. So I think it's probably not too big a challenge for you to imagine what it must feel like for someone like my grandfather to grow up as a young man, driving down the road by his village, knowing that this is where he's from, this is where his land is, and he has no right to it. He has no right to go there. This is the pattern that continues. The colonial enterprise in the West Bank is a continuation of what was done in 48. Interestingly, the very right wing of the Israeli colonial settlement movement are the first ones to admit that. They say to the left Israelis in their political discourse, they say, so why are you pointing the finger at us? What have we done wrong? We're merely doing what you did in 48. We're the good soldiers doing the right thing. That's very telling to me. And living in the West Bank, living in Ramallah, with settlements surrounding the town, and then spending time in Nazareth, where Israeli settlements surround the town, it's the same thing. The same thing in Hebron. Notorious settlements that surround Hebron, they have the commanding heights, and they've got us squeezed in below in little areas. So I hope that this is sufficiently new or off the radar to you to be interesting and useful.
تبسم وخل الهموم وخل الغموم وخل الضجر